Hello everyone, let's get a bit more in depth into the Byzantine 7th century. When you look at all the playlists that made for each century, the 7th roughly is sort of the smallest, because it's indeed the most stereotypically dark age of all the medieval millennium, even though actually it was quite varied in sort of time during the same century and in place especially. As you know, we talk often about Byzantine history. This has really become like an important column of Schwerpunkts building, so to say, and of course as a major topic in medieval history, and not only, right? The 7th century is, however, very mysterious in itself, just as much as Byzantine culture at this point has become, right? We indeed discussed more than once how we come to conceptualize the concept of Byzantine and why we actually reject any criticism, or at least most criticism, regarding its usage that actually serves pretty conventionally sound purpose that, in fact, the same Byzantinists, experts in the field, have attained. I'm going to make more videos about medieval historiography with proper authors, etc. You know, recently I made a video about Byzantinistics that explains a bit like all the various issues. But then there is something ultra fascinating about this critical century, especially in Byzantine history. Not only, again, fortunately, the same 7th century playlist is increasing in size, also thanks to episodes like this. Today we talk about some religious aspects, some cultural ones, broadly meant, etc. And we focus more on this passage that is not just the one occurring after the Islamic invasions, but also what had been boiling since basically the so-called Justinian era, that was, in a sense, the most expansive in Byzantine history, the one that seemed also more, if not foundational, because of course the Constantinian period is the actual moment, at least in which the foundations were laid. But in fact, the one in which Byzantine culture also reaches its peak, right, of effectiveness through sort of Hellenic intellectual superiority and Roman sound pragmatism, and during which also some of the greatest victories, aside from the ultimate shrinking of the empire, the loss of half of its territorial extent, definitely occurred. This is also a time of, however, great internal strife. It's not definitely a simple moment of stagnation. Like we have this notion that basically decline occurs to civilization just in the moment in which it gets stagnating, and it's sort of unaware of its own risk. Right? It happens sometimes like this, but even when the crisis comes, the outcome can be really different. And of course, the Byzantine Empire was quite equilibristic in many of its aspects, especially in the extent of territorial domination. Mostly the communities controlled by Constantinople were quite varied, and pertaining especially to very different cultural backgrounds, sort of more, say, compared to the previous Roman Empire, in much more diverse distribution, meaning that there's probably a European foundation, right, an Hellenic center of what de facto the Byzantine Empire is, and then you have an Eastern Levantine dimension, or some North African one, that is, in many cases, barely on board with the entire notion that they were, at some point, they would be faithful subjects of the empire, but that historically had ever properly assimilated that Hellenistic and Roman, let's say, establishment that in many ways had always been seen as culturally not alien, fully alien, but somehow mostly adapting from the top to the lower aspect of these greater demographic pools that, as you know, had been historically culturally influenced, but also quite subjected from millennia to different foreign dominations. This is a delicate topic because, of course, it opens to the notion why specific provinces of the empire eventually fell, etc. So it's an incredibly delicate topic, and there was nothing, for that matter, strictly deterministic about that, but the pattern to which it took historical shape, like, of course, it's not random either. So it's commonly accepted that starting in the latter half of the 6th century, there was an increasing yearning for direct connection to the divine power of the holy, right? And this in part seems to have been connected. This can be made also for a point for other times in Christian history, that the moment of crisis sort of stirred up once again the notion of responsibility, of need for some sort of moral shielding from the gradual worsening of the situation. Believers sought an unmediated access to the sacred through intensified spiritual practices, including fervent communal ones of prayer, for example, pilgrimages to sacred sites like Jerusalem and Sinai, and the proliferation, however, also more local devotional objects such as amulets inscribed with prayers or fragments of relics. It's very difficult to fully reconstruct this picture because mostly what pertained to that war, as you know, was eventually taken over by the Ottomans. Just also the Byzantine Empire had not been faring too well up to that point. So there is, even though there is an enormous legacy of the classical past and quite obvious vestiges, as you know, the same Byzantine ones are less straightforward to a degree, and or belong to, for example, the earliest part of Byzantine history when the empire was basically still intact to a degree. And even about that, frankly, we still look at, in fact, a late antique system that was increasingly focusing on the elite, and with, even though the Byzantine East is often described as socioeconomically more vibrant, more advanced than the West, etc., if you actually look at sort of properly the later phases of most of this Levantine provinces, I made a video recently about this, you realize that this notion that the East was at that point sort of that richer, more developed, or better off, or etc., is not really quite obvious already, and it makes you really wonder even about the premises of this all, meaning by that point the notion that the West simply came from more sort of recently civilized past, like as the Romans had taken over like prior tribes in the continental hinterland, as opposed to, in fact, the Levant was already the house, the home, as we've seen, of millenary civilizations, is correct, obviously, but it doesn't necessarily account for the actual moral forces involved, what could be and would be salvaged, etc. I made multiple videos, especially about the myth of Romano-Germanic backwardness, as opposed especially to a sort of, hyper-advanced Byzantine reality. Just the other day, when I made that video about 13th, 14th century Italian armies, saying, look, they had something like 10,000 plus 20,000, 30,000 armies in the span of 2 generations. There was an old date follower who said, this is interesting because I thought only the Byzantines had large armies, and the Western politics didn't really, why? Especially, considering the 13th, 14th century. I mean, the Westerners had taken over the same Byzantine Empire at large, and at least reduced it to a poor thing after the Byzantines recaptured Constantinople. But in general, like this notion that the Byzantines would be this forever advanced system that for some reason would have outclassed the West. But is it a real thing? Like, is it? In my opinion, it's just more like an internet phenomenon than some kind of, I'm fairly well acquainted at this point. You will have realized it. This to medieval history, you may doubt, of course, but say of all the comparative stuff that I've ever seen, like none actually even goes in favor, like the same Byzantinistic works in favor of this dramatic development of the Byzantine world at any time compared to the West specifically. I mean, surely the Byzantines were more advanced than other cultures out there. Even within the same Europe, there is no doubt. It was a comparatively, similar level of development, etc. In fact, that's mostly what it had historically been. There is perhaps a bit too much determinism regarding outlook. So if the Western half failed and the Eastern one succeeded, it's because the West was worse. That's not how it went down, right? In any case, we'll see this better in other videos too. But the spiritual side of the story is fascinating as well, because if you also look at the timeline, that Iconoclasm was not very far away, that the Byzantines would get into this very weird loop of, in fact, pure heterodoxy, when not overt heresy, just to try to salvage certain provinces around, and or at some point suppress certain provincial autonomies in the forms, for example, more local monastic centers, traditions of the icons themselves, etc., just to sack them fundamentally. We also recently made a video about the Byzantine decline in Italy, and we've seen on that occasion how and why things would start falling apart. I mean, the Byzantine Empire, in that sense, was not an overwhelmingly competitive culture, especially compared to the West, by any stretch of the imagination. And so if you account that we start talking about Byzantine in the 4th century, and that the empire was fundamentally well off throughout most of the rest of it, and basically the main break occurs in the late, in fact, 4th century, then definitely beginning of the 5th to some extent, and that basically by the beginning of the 7th, the Byzantines start losing entire chunks of the empire. I could say this Byzantine solidity, even just considering the eastern part of the empire historically alone, doesn't seem this clamorous success that we intend. Especially, I mean, in many ways it was incredibly successful in surviving the latter crisis, which is often an underrated aspect, especially when we realize, in fact, that not even the Muslims actually were this enormous civilization that we think they were at some point. That's also the other big myth, right? For some reason, the Westerners, as always, the most Western guys, has been described in last generations as the least developed. But the Byzantines were also much more of a civilization instead than the Arabs. Even of the Caliphal powers that formed elsewhere, and because it did really have very solid foundations at that point in places where this held, and this is the point I was making before, and that managed to actually even strike back to rebuild, and that had been partially molded by the necessity, the sheer survival, the sheer crisis. Now, the problem with studying the spiritual approach, like of the Byzantine during these later generations before the crack, is somehow very difficult, right? The methods of access, specifically of, for example, the veneration of saints and their relics, and perhaps the reverence for icons, were already firmly in place by the 6th century, as evidenced by the widespread use of reliquaries. So even the notion that this would have been simply a later development of the empire, of course, is not correct. The lower level of what had historically been the Catholic religion had always included this sort of more superstitious elements, lorded over by the heavenly dimension of rule of power. If anything, we also get a lot of elite stuff. For example, these reliquaries, right, that are one of very common source, are all in precious metals or adorned with gems that signify their sanctity, which even if it doesn't point to some specifically, let's say, individual kind of approach to spiritual life just per se. It was mostly a communitary one, but especially lorded over by powerful hierarchies, right? We also we also witness, however, the increase of devotional images in churches and private worship spaces, these are, in many cases, also relatively, really luxurious. There are different instances, for example, the encaustic icons preserved at St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai, which depict Christ, the Virgin, and saints with striking realism, which is also, in fact, incredibly almost separated from the rest of Byzantine art of this period, that, although very advanced, sometimes is sort of a bit more stylistic, still also resenting of more strictly classical influences, which means in this sense that was some sort of more now lower manifestation of spiritual life that was looking even more inwardly and sort of in a calming, soothing fashion, looking at what was happening in surroundings, but still dominated by a powerful elite that may have also increased that kind of gap. Now, historically, the legitimacy of imperial authority stemmed from the emperor's divinely safeguarded status, which was self-safeguarded, by the way, manifested through an imperial cult that had portrayed him as a divinely ordained ruler, the tradition inherited from Roman practices, but eventually transformed to emphasize the emperor's role as God's vice-regent on earth, at least in the more strictly Christian symbolism of the saint. This is particularly relevant because many people think as if, the Fabulous Apollo, also sung by Virgil, was not literally meaning the same thing in that culture, in that society. But it was literally the same concept of vicar of God, right? Of God himself at some point. Of course, Christianity sort of separated the two dimensions, but not really the transfigurational aspect was connected also with imperial sanctity to a degree. This was especially evident in the Sebastocratic nature, in fact, of Byzantine rule that maintained also some greater control over the church. The Christian influences on this cult generally amplified its authority rather than weakening it, because in many ways, in that sense, there was an autocratic form of government that, in fact, was mostly seen as a sclerotization of the initial concept. I mean, what had basically been the whole issue with the Roman Empire getting Christianized, because the sense was that the emperor had failed to a degree to deliver that divinely, unitary order, with chunks of the empire falling to the barbarians, etc., had deemed it necessary to emphasize the separation, but by retaining, in this sense, the emperor still as something, as is typical Byzantine society, ever more separated itself from the rest of the people. And so we can appreciate the same sort of detachment of some important parts of the population from the establishment at that point, even through this devotional art, right? And so especially the Byzantine emperor in this time in history was seen as the representative of the singular of a singular god, as scarcely diminished in stature compared to probably a divine emperor who held a relatively minor rank within the divine hierarchy, right? So something that eventually had not even shifted that much, the same idea of emperor and how this would have been manifest in the East. And it's important here also to, again, separate the East from the West, also within the same Byzantine Empire. And we're not talking, again, just the westernmost Byzantine provinces, but the same, say, Greek ones compared to the, in fact, the Levantine ones. Because there were different forms of proper intent in this representation. And in the way this spiritual life was lived, because at the end of the day, also the most functional part remained, that Aegean basin. Iconographically, the shift is witnessed is through the reinforcement of the by the adoption of Christian symbols in imperial regalia, So literally what was imperial before and so divinely intended now is attributed to the same Christian emperor, such as the Labarum and the Chi-Rho standards, for example. On coinage, you can see images of Christ or the Virgin, which became standard under Justinian I as well, so connecting it to the emperor. And there's a lot of also angelic symbology, in part seemingly also adopted from the Germano-Iranic iconography coming from the steppes. In any case, it seems clear that this Christian imperial authority, together with the closely linked structure of the Christian church, was bolstered by the influence attributed to holy individuals and sacred images, which asserted direct access to supernatural power through their perceived ability to channel divine grace, as evidenced by miracle accounts in geographies like those of St. Demetrius of Thessaloniki, whose intercession was believed to protect the city. This is also fully traditional, right? The notion is that since in Christian times you start also seeing such, way to tradition more strictly documented and articulated by Christian literacy, codicological preservation, and so on, as something new. And many people, again, are convinced that basically Christianity was not the same Catholic religion existing before the same advent of Christ. Many people confuse it even with the Christians copied the older religion. No, it was the same religion. And again, if you've never heard of this, welcome to Schwerpunkt, by the way. But this is not only, it's really about realizing how this was adapting comparatively to the previous era that in many ways reflected the needs of for this more specific devotional predispositions. Furthermore, even conventional imperial authority was gradually conveyed through images that evoked a more immediate sacred authority, as seen in increasing use of Christian iconography on seals, public monuments, and even utilitarian objects like lead seals used in trade, which often bore images of the Virgin or the Cross. This is evident at the start of the 7th century in the deployment of icons of Christian saints, especially the Mother of God, as similar as military standards, in portrayals of Christian armies battling under the Virgin's safeguard. And this military iconography is very important. For example, even her aid as recorded in accounts of miraculous interventions during sieges, such as the 626 hour Persian one of Constantinople, where the Acatist hymn attributed the city's salvation to the Virgin's intercession. And in the role assigned to the Virgin as the guardian of Constantinople, a role formalized in liturgical processions carrying her icon along the city wall, the Theotokos. The sacralization of authority is also apparent in the growing emphasis placed on the Patriarch's coronation of the Emperor. This ritual was invariably performed in a church from the early 7th century and in the Great Church of Hagia Sophia from 641, when Constance II was crowned by Patriarch Paul II, symbolizing the divine sanction of imperial rule through ecclesiastical ritual. It's a ceremony that integrated hymns and prayers to underscore the emperor's divine mandate. However, the institutional church may have perceived the widespread presence of the holy in the 7th century even as a threat. We explain why. This is something that was partly occurring also in other parts of Christendom, especially when you evaluate the historical antagonism notoriously existing between the secular clergy and the monasteries. That's what in part will also trigger certain more brutal manifestations of the same iconoclasm. You can immediately see the seeds being sown at this point. And what we just said regarding the spread of a more down-the-line devotional practice that fundamentally was ever more private, ever more in this very vast empire, surely diversified based on, just think about the different languages this was done into, and think what kind of measures of control could exist. We know very well how the various metropolitic sees, especially Alexandria, the eastern ones, Antioch, Jerusalem, were essentially tending toward some, but the greatest problem was caused by Alexander's own interest, that there was always like a very delicate balance, right, ongoing within these places, and especially with the government of Constantinople, it could just do so much to enforce a more orthodox religious, probably doctrine, but policy in that regard, in as much as an orthodox doctrine reflected also the loyalty to the empire, the Catholic Empire. That's when the Byzantines begin actually to make concessions to heterodoxy and heresy to try to salvage these eastern provinces that, as you know, were quite relevant, as Alexandria's grain fed also the mob of Constantinople. And you understand how dramatic, really, the loss of all the East. Alexandria specifically opened the gates to the Arabs, really was for Constantinople. This is interesting because in some cases there may have been also more devotionally faithful practices down the line than at the top, especially as the metropolitic sees were incredibly political and opportunistically siding in many ways. So there is also an institutional church, so to say, in the moment in which Constantinople becomes the most important city, even though it was of all these the non-apostolic center, even though Constantine had himself buried around the tombs of the apostles that he had translated from other places exactly to confer legitimacy. You understand here the symbol of the Virgin lording over Constantinople, protecting it. And there is surely a resurgence of those superstitiously sort of Pelagian aspects, like the Virgin, of course, being integral part of the also pre-Christian Catholic tradition, but with a very strong feminine emphasis on this religion, especially among the mob, that naturally as fourth estaters tended towards more that kind of attitude, a bit like the left today does, more sort of apparently tolerant or at least, indulgent, just to control, to psychological control better. So there are lots of interesting dynamics going on that are difficult to simply trace across these generations. Surely, the proliferation of relics and icons risk diluting centralized ecclesiastical control. Again, that's what, in a sense, after the loss of the provinces in the East, Iconoclasm tried to do, once again, to suppress the more sort of fractally localistic dispersions of also properly of devotional power, because devotional power could, as we've seen, reinforce the same ecclesiastical hierarchies. We've seen this also in the West with the relics, with the tombs of the saints. By the way, we explained how the Holy Ghost was indeed believed to flow through the actual remains of the saints. Given this is not a superstition, actually. It's superstitious, of course, in the moment in which you think it's a merely material contact or something that goes beyond, say, the relation of the faithful with a saint and divine power. But if you look at the videos I made, especially last autumn, about probably the doctrine of the afterlife, in traditional terms, you do know that the saint, having earned his place in the firmament, actually does keep interfering, so say influencing in the world with his actions, his power, and this connects also to his somatic soul that also comes back, that remains within the next to the body, to the totemic, say the somatic clanic totem, right? of the underworld. So there is a lot of very interesting things going on within the same Christian beliefs that we presume having, again, simply changed what existed before. These were the same identical beliefs that existed in pre-Christian times, because this was the same identical Catholic religion that existed before Christ. That most people literally do not have the palest idea of it. That is the single most elementary notion of history of religions. The proliferation of local shrines, such as those dedicated to Saint Manus in Egypt, that also attracted pilgrims independent of episcopal oversight at that point. So it wasn't even just a problem of, again, the center of the empire to the periphery. You can imagine the sense of security that, of course, like leaving Constantinople, regardless of the issues of the era, like felt in that time. But it's also a problem within the same metropolitic districts, all right? Again, the archiepiscopal power cannot fully control what is happening in the countryside. In the same period in Rome, you have Gregory the Great that is basically fully understanding this shift, this shrinking in the late antique paradigm, even though he came from one of the most powerful senatorial episcopal families of that background in Rome, to open to what was essentially the reform, let's say of Saint Benedict, the establishment of an order that talked mostly to the this rural world that in many ways won over Europe in an incredibly successful way, and could have not really proliferated in the same way, in the same sort of tandem with the church, hadn't just been for like a giant like Gregory the Great made multiple videos about the evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons, but also the, in fact, more autonomous spread of these institutions in a West that, of course, did not have like a unified imperial authority, but that still found the ways, the means to stick together actually in that Latin Germanic Catholic cultural unity. Something that instead the East struggled to find, right? What was lost to the Arabs in size was won by Rome, like through the evangelization of Europe on the other side. And so there is something, as we were saying before, that doesn't add up. We simply presume that the eastern half of the empire had all the right fundamentals to go on in the way we really intend. Besides, it's not like the Arab world brought any other particular advancement, as we were saying before, roughly speaking, right? You know, they were great cultures, like in terms of statal development and, you know, they inherited much of the Byzantine and Persian system there. But at large, they also installed themselves, in fact, on some pre-existing regional entities that also, after all these wars and shocks, had not been faring too well. All right. Now, in the Byzantine East, the Church undoubtedly found it challenging to exert the same control over the sanctity embodied in saints, their images, and relics that popes and bishops had secured in the Western Church already. And we're talking, again, the beginning of the 7th century. So, chapeau to the West once again. Where episcopal oversight of relic veneration was more tightly regulated as well. And this all without an hegemonic church, right? One ruled by a single autocrat that also had much greater power properly on the church proper. Consider that the Byzantines did not have that great power on Rome, even though they actually were technically still in charge over there. We've seen also pretty violent things happening there, but that alienate the sympathies of the local population at large, and that will make, in fact, Rome falling not much out of the Byzantine orbit per se, but surely of any direct control, and the papacy instead filling that void. But we see, again, for example, the time of Charlemagne is not that far away, because as seen in the structured relic translations as early as under Ambrose of Milan, we're talking about the time of St. Augustine. So, or the later Carolingian regulations as well, to remain in the wake of that, because they're just basically 300 years away. Again, we have this notion that the West was this less regulated, less power concentrated, less sort of civilized system, and it doesn't add up, right? Again, already the East was structured. We could really take long digressions to see how and why. Again, I made videos on, well, now I can check it, but let's say, really, we talked about how the myth that especially the Levantine provinces were better structured in the West as part of this collective, marvelous Eastern Roman Empire is not really correct, right? They were not less orderly, they were not less compact, they were not less cooperative systems at all, right, than the Latin Germanic one. It was faring actually pretty darn well. And exactly along these patterns, and exactly in these years, so allegedly the years in which everything should have been the worst of all, like the terrible Dark Ages, right? Something that doesn't add up, that made that video about on paganism, Christianity, and well, that's one of the few videos I use the term paganism, and that debunks, by the way, some Marxist attempts at trying to depict the 7th century as some moment of failure of Christianity. It was the single most successful moment in Europe in terms of sheer accomplishment, of foundation, and stabilization of full Christianization of these people that would not be reverted. So it really makes you think. We can find other instances, like Sophronius, who was a monk in Palestine before becoming Patriarch of Jerusalem in 634, leading opposition to monothelitism through his disciple Maximus, whose impact on the Orthodox in Palestine was so profound that monothelites in Syrian Palestine dubbed them Maximians, reflecting the strength of his theological influence in defending a Theothelite Christology, which affirmed essentially Christ's two wills in accordance with the Council of Chalcedon. This example shows how contrasting, actually, this ecclesiastical life was also within a strictly, secular dimension, and how, in fact, the fractures within these churches were evident. In the West, there's none of this, right? Even when you see so-called Arian rulers, we don't have an actual evidence of persecution, of destruction, of some fractal theological issues. On the contrary, when the Pope was struggling against the Byzantines regarding this doctrinal matters, because they were absolutely intolerable, actually the same, Arian Longobards, etc., supported the papacy. There was an incredibly sound orthodoxy in the West during this time that the Byzantines fundamentally appeared particularly bad in the light of, meaning what they were just doing, also for very concrete political reasons. Again, it's not like some of these heresies had any chance to basically, you want to really take that into account to root, for example, in the core of the Byzantine world. No, they were basically stances that, say, the Egyptians, the Palestinians, etc., took as they were trying to unhinge themselves from the empire. By the way, throughout, as we've seen also in the video about Heraclius, etc., terrible wars, invasions, armies going back and forth. So actually very, very, very bad moments. In the West, the cake had been cooling off fundamentally. The period, of course, was tough for everybody involved, but it was also less, exposed to immediate invasions that the Byzantine Empire had to routinely cope with. So there is a lot of that as well. But there is also like a definitely different system that mostly is rooted in the difference between the Latin world, the Greek world, and this Levantine one that had also during the Roman Empire remained quite strongly distinct from one another at the root of these regional boundaries. Now, in the latter half of the 7th century, so we're talking about also after the during the Islamic invasions, so when the empire was really under severe stress, the to say at this point, Orthodox Christians in Palestine encountered a new reality. Previously, they had subscribed to an imperial orthodoxy ultimately enforced through persecution under emperors like Heraclius, who promoted monothelitism to reconcile Monophysites and Chalcedonians amid Persian and Arab threats. So that didn't really help at all to stabilize the system that began to crumble, in fact, under Heraclius himself. Now, under Arab rule following the conquest of the 1630s, culminating in the surrender of Jerusalem to Caliph Umar in 637, these Orthodox Christians face opposition from other Christian sects, the Monophysites, who emphasized Christ's single divine nature. The Monothelites, who supported a single will to bridge theological divides, and even the Nestorians, who maintained a stricter separation of Christ's natures, as well as from non-Christians, including Jews, Samaritans, Manichaeans, and later Muslims, whose presence in the region grew after the establishment of the Umayyad Caliphate, in particular in 661, which set Damascus as center of religious and political authority. And I would like to stress that all those Christian sects that we just listed, next to the actual Theothelite Orthodox ones, were largely a product of that previous Byzantine world. I mean, of course, you can even try to look at this in, I don't know, there was a broader legacy of the previous mentalities among these people. So this is a bit too far-fetched to some sense. There's some to it. But in many ways, it was instrumental because, as you've seen, there were also Orthodox here that were fighting for, in fact, affirming preserving amidst this, because they had become minority, really, in the process, and not just because of the Arabs, the riotous way, and instead found themselves as a fractal front, quarreling with all these other groups that, had they been simply on board with full orthodoxy, like in the West, aside again from nominal claims of Arianism, but without any broader theological debate or, again, political divisions, whatever, broad, if not also in that case dictated by other reasons that did not put, in this sense, religion at the center. It's not like you find any particular evidence that, I don't know, when the Longobards fought against the Byzantine in Italy, the Arian faith was something that inspired these people more than, I don't know, with certain symbols, with certain expressions. If anything, the objectives were completely different. It was about winning over the majority that were Catholic Romans, as a matter of fact, with, in fact, the full Catholicization of everybody involved, like the Longobards basically abandoning that and being actually quite tolerant since the beginning. Not even the Vandals had been that. Not even the Goths had more problems regarding that, but mostly because of how their establishment was structured within, probably the Gothic system. Not much because they had, again, great problems against especially the other Christians. So again, was this actually such a stable system that survived the West with great effectiveness? It doesn't really seem so. Besides, the aforementioned Orthodoxes that remain in the Islamic controlled land now in the Levant were obliged to defend their convictions and articulate the exact nature of their faith because of this greater diversity all around, relying on theological precision to maintain their identity in a multi-religious environment where Christians were now a protected but subordinate community under the dhimmi system. You understand how needlessly complicated religious division is, and how, of course, also especially political division is. But again, people wanted this. It's not like some Bedouins sprang out of the desert with an allegedly new faith and simply took over the entire system just because this was largely due to the inhabitants of these other regions that had historically been unloyal to the empire. And also in, again, very critical moments, because before the Arabs, again, there were the Persians out there that were actually a much greater threat to the empire, regardless of all these issues. And lands conquered by the Persians, also up to North Africa, had managed to crush yet again. and exhausting itself in the process. Now, to achieve the preservation of orthodoxy in those Islamic lands, because, by the way, of course, the Orthodox connection kept existing, right? This happened also in other places later on. Christians kept living within the Islamic world, and as such, they felt themselves connected with the empire or any other Christian authority outside of it, as a polity, as a freer and more central church. And so, in order to preserve themselves and spread orthodoxy further, these groups had to concentrate on logic and precise definitions, as persuasion was now their only means of defending and advancing their stance, but too late, seemingly. Even though large communities, of course, of Orthodox remained in the region, without recourse to secular power, by the way, especially after the loss of Byzantine political control in the Levant following the Battle of Yarmouk in 636. One aspect of this refinement in the expression and comprehension of the Christianity of the ecumenical synods was engagement with polemics against Jews whose communities remained vibrant in Palestine and Syria. Also, sort of supported by the Muslims. This was evident also in Spain later on, etc., especially because there were lots of Jews in particular already. And, of course, like already in Palestine and Syria, the Jewish communities had been native to this land that had spread further historically from a very long time across the Mediterranean. And this is evidenced by the continued use of Hebrew inscriptions in synagogues like Beth Alpha, for example. And we're talking also fairly prosperous communities, also because, as we were explaining it just the other day, when talking even about later medieval North African and Islamic state building, for example, there were prominent courtly Jews, like there would be the Off Judah, like among the Habsburgs, etc., because, of course, the Jews were allowed to do certain things with money that the sort of other monotheistic precepts rejected. Besides being a minority, they were thought to be very loyal to constituted authority that safeguarded them. And in fact, also the same church was very, very protective of the Jews. Like the mobs could not simply attack them or do something like that. So actually, like, it's not modern tolerance, but it's something that, let's say, for those times is quite relevant. Now, following a prolonged period of minimal interaction with the Jews or even basic rebuttals of Judaism, the latter half of the 7th century saw a striking increase in such Orthodox writings driven by the need, as we've seen, to clarify Christian doctrines in this circumstance. Some examples are the Doctrina Jacobi Nuper Baptizzate, which records a dialogue between a Christian and a Jew. Most of these emerged from regions conquered by the Arabs: Syria, Palestine, the Sinai Peninsula, and Cyprus, where Christian communities lived alongside different religious groups under Umayyad governance at that point. Remember that without the Christian fleets, the Christian harbors of Egypt, Palestine, and Syria, the Muslims would have never been able to besiege Constantinople 711, and they failed anyway. So that's quite interesting. And I spoke about this also in the videos about the Saracens, because we assumed that the Saracens were just some sort of, brown people, all devoted to Islam. This is not quite the case, both in the West and in the East of the Mediterranean. Let's say a very consistent amount of Saracens was actually Christian, and they literally alongside the Muslims. So also at that point, there wasn't much of a solely religious purpose, or these were realities where, as we said before, it was mostly like the pre-existing regional demographic basis that played the major role, even under the Islamic banner. Not the nominal Islamic banner. Think about how many Christians exist, I don't know, in Muslim Spain. I mean, it's there is in all of this also a need for apologetic literature, under properly the Islamic government. Some of these texts indicate that Jews themselves initiated these debates, interestingly enough, prompting Christians to develop new defenses of doctrines like the Trinity, which emphasized the unity and distinction of the three divine persons using Aristotelian and Neoplatonic categories, and practices such as the veneration of saints, relics, and icons, which were justified as mediating divine presence without constituting idolatry, as articulated in Anastasius of Sinai's Hodegos and Leontius of Neapolis' sermons. Naturally, the Holy Trinity is a very sound Catholic notion, actually the same Judaism. I will not digress now on the strictly theological issues because they require really another video. So, Judaism fully formed actually much later than Christianity, in the way we probably intended today. There's not to say, of course, that Jews did not exist before that, but let's say also the specific doctrines that occurred, say, to constitute what we understand as Judaism today, formed in late antiquity, and so on part in their turn as a response to Christianity. And as Islam, actually, they're not particularly, and that's also the other big elephant in the room, particularly open to the concept of the Trinity, because actually that could be easily derived, and it is easily derived, not just Christianly speaking, from the Old Testament as well. That, of course, not just in a Christian way, you can understand how, Christ's example is a fulfillment of. This is, like, again, not any passive-aggressive remark against the Jews. Absolutely not. You know that this channel does not tolerate any kind of, basically, of pro, whatever, attacks the Jews just for the... If you really believe to be a superior race to Jews and feel threatened by them, but good luck proving that you're not the Untermensch, by the way. And in any case, actually, in fact, in the West, Jews had also a very important role. But indeed, Islam does not accept. There is a much more totalizing aspect behind this, and mostly a problem that would interfere also, in fact, with the later empire. The same iconoclasm in many ways, touching on many aspects of the paradoxes. We know too few about the iconoclastic doctrine to be sound about, how, for example, the Trinitarian issue interfered with the destruction of the icons, with aniconism, that was evidently inspired, also in that case, by Islam and by those communities that in the frontier of the Byzantine Empire were winking at the Arabs, just like these other Levantines had done. So it is an actual issue. And you have, in parallel with this doctrinal elucidation from the Orthodox side in Islamic lands, also primarily in Palestine, an expression of Christian doctrines through liturgical poetry. This is also very interesting, which formed the cornerstone of monastic worship and was exemplified by the hymnographic figures of, for example, Sophronius, whose anacreontic hymns celebrate feasts like the Annunciation, and later Andrew of Crete, whose great canon provided a penitential framework for Lent that remains central to Orthodox worship still today. So look at what strong contact was maintained, by the way, with the East, even under the Muslims. Like Piran said, okay, the Arabs arrived, the Mediterranean is fractured. There's no passage. Actually, no, because the same Muslims were actually revolving around what mostly Europe had sort of been about, and they themselves were trying, of course, to venture there, but with scarce result, as you know. And it would be beautiful. We should talk more about Islamic history from the other side, because it's like with the things we say about the Byzantine world in comparison to the Latin Germanic one, for example. You can't see it fully until you understand how that system was from the within, because otherwise you will think this was this homogeneous blob that all the other sort of issues do not seem to add up, towards, and that's not quite in fact the case. All what we described here eventually influenced the worship of the Orthodox Church, meaning probably the Byzantine one on the other side, and the churches that derived their Christianity from Constantinople, including, for example, the ones in Georgia, where the Yadgari hymnals preserved early translations of Greek hymns, and Armenia, which adopted Byzantine liturgical forms while retaining distinct traditions like the Sharakan. And of course, the pivotal century for this definition, defense, and expression of orthodoxy is literally the mid-7th to the mid-8th century, a time of theological consolidation amid political upheaval just think about the Islamic conquest, but also the loss of Byzantine territories, and the internal crisis like the deposition of Justinian II, and the same iconoclasm, right? We described all of these parts of that, and again, I'm glad of how we are gradually stratifying the available knowledge existing. I'm glad that we're managing to balance and stratify all our content here in ways that get intertwined. We talk about medieval Georgian warfare, we talk about a bit from later times, but say, you can check all these places and see what were they really about, what was going on at this point. This era, so mid-7th, mid-8th century, is also exemplified by the works of John of Damascus, a former Umayyad official who became a Palestinian monk at the monastery of St. Sabas around 700, and identified as a Byzantine Christian, as a matter of fact, despite living under Arab rule, where he composed his fount of knowledge and treatises defending icons against early iconoclastic tendencies. Its initial challenge was the iconoclasm imposed by Byzantine emperors, because you could think, again, this was just a problem in the Byzantine Empire. It wasn't. This engulfed the entire Orthodox Christianity within the Caliphates as well, and largely instead left the West unscathed. So again, those issues that the Byzantines had triggered in many ways reverberated in their own side, let's say, of Christendom. Beyond, let's say, in fact, the Byzantine emperor's political authority, these Christians resided with all these issues, beginning with Leo III's decrees against icons in the 20s of the 8th century, which were influenced by Islamic aniconic traditions and Jewish critiques of religious images, as well as internal Byzantine concerns about idolatry. As mentioned, opponents refer to this form of Christianity as Maximinianism, but its depth to Maximus extended beyond mere adherence to Diothelite Chalcedonianism, as upheld at the Lateran Synod of 649. So also Rome intervenes in this, because, as we said, they were ever more autonomous, but still connected with the empire. The Synod had been, obviously, convened in Rome, in the Lateran Basilica by Pope Martin I to reject monothelitism, and confirmed at the Sixth Ecumenical Synod of 680-81, which condemned monothelitism after debates involving 174 bishops in Constantinople. Maximus' brilliance as a theologian lay in his ability to integrate diverse strands of Greek theological thought into a cohesive synthesis, creating a framework that addressed both doctrine and spirituality, let's say, with unparalleled depth, influencing subsequent Orthodox theology. One strand was the dogmatic theology of the prominent Alexandrian patriarchs, Athanasius, who defended the consubstantiality of the Son with the Father at Nicaea in 325, and Cyril of Alexandria, whose Christology shaped Chalcedon in 1451, which underpinned the dogmas ratified by the ecumenical synods from the 4th to the 6th centuries, establishing what we conventionally understand as the framework for Orthodox Christology. Another was the Christian Hellenism of the 4th century Cappadocian Fathers, Basil of Caesarea, whose liturgical contributions shaped the Divine Liturgy, Gregory of Nazianzus, whose theological orations clarified Trinitarian doctrine, and Gregory of Nyssa. These are very, very famous names of the Cappadocian Fathers, in whose mystical writings explore the soul's ascent to God, right? What is interesting about them is all their also cultural legacy from places like, for example, Cappadocia, that had historically been also close to other fringe areas. Think about, theologically wise, think about Galatia, right? And so they had sort of specialized even in coping with against heresy, but mostly within this fractally Orthodox Byzantine world that, again, does not inspire that Catholic unity that the empire proposed itself to uphold. Gregory of Nyssa articulated the Trinity and the relationship between divine and human natures using Greek philosophical tools like those of Plato and Plotinus. That, of course, at the time they didn't even really understand there were two different authors, but they somehow were carrying much of some very strongly traditional principles we will probably analyze sometime soon. A third strand was the ascetic wisdom of the Desert Fathers. I made a very early video of Schwerpunkt about them. At some point we'll have to descend in greater depth about them as well. From the 4th century Egyptian desert, like Anthony, right? So these were probably the founders of monasticism, also as we know it in the West, right? As far as the desert, it's not just like the hot African one, it's just the desertum in a Latin sense. So it could be even the most obscure, like Irish coastal residences. And Anthony, whose life was recorded by Athanasius, famously enough, and Pachomius, of course, who established communal monasticism specifically. And their successors, because there was a lot of ascetical lifestyle in the desert, not just merely a monastic one, right? And their successors in the Judean desert east of Jerusalem, the coastal desert of Gaza, were Barsanuphius and John mentored ascetics and the rugged mountains of the Sinai Peninsula, home to St. Catherine's Monastery, whose teachings emphasized spiritual discipline and contemplation as paths to divine union. It was always a bit very much part of the Christian, the Christian tension, let's say, that contemplation, or at least this different sides of the same story, to say which element of society had to think about the former, which one the latter, right? This would be in part also at the center of an investiture controversy in the West, and so on. Now, the aforementioned Maximus intertwined these elements with resulting framework permeated by the Neoplatonic metaphysics of the likely early 6th century Syrian monk writing under the pseudonym Dionysius the Areopagite, a convert of St. Paul the Apostle, whose celestial hierarchy and divine names provided a mystical theology of divine transcendence and participation, influencing Byzantine liturgical aesthetics, and not only. Right, these were ultra-Neoplatonistic works that would heavily inform, together with Augustine de Musica, literally the Gothic architecture that you look at. It was properly considered in that sort of Neoplatonic, Neo-Pythagorean sort of harmony, proportions of numbers, etc. And that even in the Gothic architecture you can see as mirroring light, literally, as if the internal of the shrine, it was pure divine power, something fully transcendental, while the world outside, of course, something scarier and but still imposing to decipher. Now, this theological perspective of St. Maximus informed the more restrained, even austere, doctrinal synthesis of John of Damascus, with treatises such as on the Orthodox faith and 3 treatises on the divine images, systematized Christian doctrine with clarity and precision, serving as a bulwark against both iconoclasm and Islamic theological challenges by grounding Christian practices in sculptural and patristic authority. Maximus' vision, which interlinked humankind, the cosmos, and the scriptures, was mirrored in the domed interiors of Byzantine churches, where frescoes and mosaics, such as those in the Cora Church, depicted the cosmic order under Christ's dominion as Pantocrator, integrating creation, incarnation, and eschatology. Right. So, of course, the Byzantines had a very similar tradition, at least in terms of transferring, like say, translating the proper divine harmony through certain specific theological texts, in dealing with numerology, with probably the doctrine of the images, into actual architecture. This again would be an object of content, especially also during Iconoclasm, to a degree that, as you understand, is proportional to the what has to be showed. Really, it's not merely a random case. In that space, as Maximus elaborated in his reflection on divine liturgy, known as mystagogia, the liturgical rites involving clergy and laity celebrated the full scope of the Christian mystery, from creation to Christ's second coming, in a manner that probed the depths of human experience and illuminated cosmic mysteries through the interplay of word, gesture, and symbol, as seen in the intricate choreography of the cherubic hymn during the Great Entrance, which symbolized the angels' worship as well, that especially since Justinian's times had really increased very strongly. This also came mostly from a European background. It's important to stress how syncretic it really was, but all elements were somehow still represented in that truly Catholically unifying system that Constantinople really strived to remain. Yet shifting from what might appear as such lofty ideals, though conveyed through gesture, movement, melody, and color in ways that likely resonated with even the humblest Byzantine Christians, as seen in the accessibility of liturgical hymns chanted in village churches, for example, in urban cathedrals alike, because this had to be a cosmic wave, like something radiating from the center, probably to Constantinople understood as a sort of monastery and almost a heavenly Jerusalem, or an earthly Jerusalem in that sense. But what's the difference at that point towards the outer side? This was the truer principle of monasticism, also as far as the West was concerned. And just as Rome had been, telling the truth, the exact copy of Rome for any other city that was founded in the empire, and so mirroring that divine standard in the doctrine of the two natures to the lower one. This is also a more detailed depiction of the Byzantine church life in the 7th century that also emerges from the 102 canons of the so-called Quinisext Synod, summoned by Emperor Justinian II in 692, which was actually a pretty contentious moment in the history of the church. Also, very deep strains with the West at that point, even more. In any case, like his predecessor and namesake, Justinian II aimed to distinguish his reign and assert his imperial authority by convening an ecumenical synod, reinforcing the emperor's role as guardian of orthodoxy in a time of definitely military setbacks, such as the loss of Carthage to the Arabs that had occurred in 698. Earlier synods deemed ecumenical had been called to resolve urgent doctrinal disputes, but with the monoenergist/monothelite controversy settled at the Sixth Ecumenical Synod, no such issue warranted the synod. However, the prior two ecumenical synods, the second 553 and third 680-81 in Constantinople, had issued only doctrinal canons, with earlier synods like those of Nicaea in 325 and Chalcedon 451 had addressed both doctrinal and disciplinary matters, establishing precedents for church governance, clerical conduct, and lay piety. Consequently, the Synod of Justinian II convened, which issued solely disciplinary canons, was viewed as completing the work of the Fifth and Sixth Ecumenical Synods, and was thus named the Fifth Sext, so the Quinisext in Latin, or Penthecta in Greek, Ecumenical Synod. It is also known as the Synod in Trullo, or the Trullan Synod, due to the dome chamber Trullos in the Imperial Palace where it was held, right? a setting that underscored the integration of imperial and ecclesiastical authority. As it had been well established from a long time, Constantine's one was actually the founding moment, but as we've seen, Justinian II took inspiration very much from Justinian I, who was the guy who sort of locked the system a bit during the great pandemic of his age, at the end of the great expansion of the empire, the reconquest phase, so to say, and the crisis that answered, that sort of crystallized very much Byzantine history. So Justinian II displayed this imperial power in his own regard, naturally in a much less props per moment for the empire. Still, however, presiding alongside Patriarch Callinicus with 211 bishops in attendance, which was not a few for the time. Also considering the movements, again, the fact that there were Muslims in Mediterranean, everything was pretty complicated. The canons addressed a wide range of issues, from prohibiting pagan practices, as they had in part also maintained. We're talking, as we countlessly explained, like those fractally anti-Catholic, superstitious lower kind, not what people think today paganism was. So the alter ego of, organized religion. No, before Christianity, there was a Catholic tradition that loathed pagan practices, in charge of the great civilizations of the world. You have even, for example, the prohibition of memes and theatrical performance during religious festivals. They had become too sort of worldly. In the Trullan Synod, clerical marriage was regulated, which is something, for example, that is quite interesting, because also in the West there were different issues regarding this, but the West paradoxically was already more along that line than we think. Essentially, the Synod allowed priests to remain married, but forbidding them to bishops to marry, and standardizing the production of religious art as well, such as Canon 82, which mandated depicting Christ in human form rather than as a lamb, to emphasize the incarnation, reflecting the Church's efforts to standardize practices and maintain doctrinal purity in a period of theological and political flux. So just think about how different this would look compared to the Iconoclasm. In fact, Iconoclasm began to emerge in part in response to external religious pressures and internal debates over the role of images that were in part triggered at this time as well. And when we will resume, like Iconoclasm as well, remind this, because we're not talking about some random dynamic, but one that was really together with the entire notion of what this Byzantine Catholic effort had been, also relatively to powers, lands, the communities that had remained outside of the empire as the Arabs had taken them over. So that is also quite fascinating, because it illustrates how much this broader Western legacy continued in the East. How many Christians not remained there, as we know, but how important this would be for the development of the same Orthodox Christianity, as these people were essentially maintaining an influence over the same empire, right? And its religious practices, even if they were from the other side. So this is really intense, and somehow more than unexpected, I would say. Reflecting how illusory to an extent still just the idea of single separated polities on a territorial basis that they really are, like how much politics actually travels far and wide and well beyond these kind of boundaries. So it's great, again, to talk about this. Is also for history of Christianity or Orthodoxy Christianity as well, that we often haven't made an overwhelming amount of videos on, but it tells you how complicated it was and how sort of difficult. This was the best of what the Byzantine Empire had, would have control from Constantinople, aside from this, again, the Aegean center around. And just think about how the evangelization of other peoples, and basically in the steppes, or right around it, was sort of just basically what had almost remained left in Europe for this, as also the Roman Catholics were prevailing actually in the West and even threatening to win over even places like Bulgaria, that would have was interested in playing that card, at least up to a certain point, to rival with Saint Constantinople. All right. So these are all things we will look better at some other point. In any case, for today, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.